So, all right. So let's start this off. Um, just let's get a little bit of motivation. What brings you to this call? Um, if you're playing around with this project, what's your motivation? What are you trying to build? So, in fact, I've got a little cheat sheet with some notes here. So yeah, anybody who would like to share, just let us know who you are, what you're building with this tool now, what problems does it solve, and what problems is it not solving that you'd like it to.
I'm B. Burdett on there, and I did that Schelm project.
That was awesome. I love that. That blew my mind. It was great.
That was a lot of fun, and that was kind of like a little test to what I kind of want to do is make a sort of a music blog type of thing where I can have like musical notation in a little window or pane that's in the document, and then be able to script that with Schelm and maybe have some other controls too.
Oh, like a live music performance tool?
Well, more like a thing like you might load up exercises or something. Like one idea
Oh,
I
cool.
had is like make a little game where you'd get a melody and then you do counterpoint a counterpoint melody, and then you get a score based on like how good is
Wow.
does your melody obey the counterpoint rules. And or another one would be just just different things, where you might have a melody and put chords to it, or just have different musical exercises and ideas that you could express in a document.
That's awesome. Hey, Philip, how's it
Hi.
going? Great to see. Put a face to the name.
Nice. Does my audio work?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you.
Nice.
You're sounding good. Yeah, cool. So, B. Burdett, that sounds amazing. Have you seen Ryan Fraser's stuff that he's been doing with making sheet music notation in Elm and stuff like that? It's pretty cool.
I should take a look at that. I wrote
Yeah,
a
check it
thing
out.
to do sheet music a while back in WebGL in
Yeah,
Elm,
cool.
but I haven't open sourced that as of yet, and I might do that.
You should definitely check it out. Yeah.
Okay.
He's been doing a lot of cool stuff. Yeah, I'll shoot you some links after this. But that's amazing. Cool. So is there anything? Are there any problems that you've encountered so far that elm-markdown is not currently solving for you that you'd like it to?
Well, I haven't done a whole lot since I did that first project, so I can't really point to specific shortcomings at this point. I mean, so far so good. In other words.
Nice. Cool. Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you so much. That was great. Cool. Anybody else want to share on these 3 points?
Yeah, me maybe.
Yes, please, Jonas. Hey.
So good evening from Germany.
Yes.
From here.
I think we have a lot of people from Germany. I suspect that Germans appreciate a good parser.
Maybe, yes, yeah. But yeah, we have like a custom built CMS for things we sell online, and we have markdown fields in there, and I'm rewriting now to the user-facing front end for our website, and it's written in Elm, of course. And I decided to use Tailwind for the rendering. So I need to be able to control the rendered HTML of the markdown. And then I just used your library. There's an existing one that also gives you lets you control the HTML by exposing the AST. And but for now, we only need to control the HTML, but longer term plans are also to have like a better editor for our editorial team, So I would like to use like the custom element feature to validate their input and have like a nice UI in the backend as well. And yeah,
Nice.
So it's solving the Tailwind CSS thingy for us, and it's just a Markdown renderer for now. But yeah, there were some edge cases for some Markdown syntax, but yeah, we talked about those a little bit, and they are in the next version, and I think the next version will fix most of those. But I will report back if I find more issues. Yeah.
Awesome. That's great. Cool. Anybody else want to share?
So yeah, I would like to share too.
Cool. Hey, Philip.
So I've been writing my blog with Elm Pages and elm-markdown.
Nice.
And I wanted to include some interactive graphics in there. And I love to write those in Elm. And I also like to configure my blog with Elm Pages in general. And so I tried it out and went with some design. So some blocks in my HTML, for example, have their own model. And right now it works via some map that stores all the models of all elements on the page. And this works out pretty nicely with elm-markdown. I'm pretty happy that I can render to functions or whatever. So this is something I use heavily.
Yeah, I have to give a shout out to Matt Griffith, who's on the call, for the inspiration for that. Hey, Matt, thanks for joining. I think Matt's probably interested too. Matt's been talking about doing some community calls like this with Elm UI, which will be super cool. But yeah,
definitely.
I have to thank you, Matt, for the big inspiration for just the idea of rendering to a function, which I think is so powerful. Elm markup, which Matt built and had a lot of really creative ideas on, was a big inspiration for a lot of the things that I ended up doing in this library. So yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, kind of like a parallel approach and different way to solve a similar set of problems.
Yeah, I've seen his talk.
Yeah,
in the library.
Yeah, really cool talk. Yeah, cool. Yeah, thanks, Philip. Also, I'll get into some code examples, but Philip has been doing some really cool like experiments, and we've been having a lot of chats on the Elm Slack about some of his ideas for the library, which has been so. I really appreciate all of your insights and work on that, Philip. And yeah, we've got a lot of people who've done some really cool contributions. Cool. All right. Anybody else want to share on these 3 points?
Sure, I can share real quick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Steven. I'm just working on a chat application, and I need to support Markdown in there, and I've got some cool ideas for how I can support different kinds of tags, and just kind of extending to allow different kinds of elements in there, and I think the AST manipulation there will be really cool. So
nice.
Yeah, for now,
are you Steven Reddecup or are you a different Steven?
Yeah, that's me. Yeah.
Oh, hey, nice to hear your voice, Steven. We've chatted a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been helpful for you guys. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, just having fun with the parser too.
Yeah, I know. It's yeah. It's hurts your brain a lot working on parsers, but it's also surprisingly fun.
Sure.
Awesome. All right. Anybody else want to share? That good? Shall we dive into the next point on the agenda? Cool. All right. So, all right. There are so many things that I would like to discuss, which is exciting and a little bit. Hopefully, I can keep this conversation focused and concise, because there are just like so many fun design directions to explore with this right now. So Okay, let's start with this idea that I'm exploring, which is ambiguous markdown. So the previous versions of the parser have had the ability to fail, which some of you have noticed. Like let's pull up this Ellie example maybe and take a look at what that looks like. So this is like the current release. And if I were to do something like this, I'm starting a link, right? Then as I'm typing, it's saying, well, the link is not valid yet, right? Which is what we're used to in Elm. You type something and it's not valid syntax and you get an error message. But with Markdown, there's no such thing as invalid syntax. Now, it turns out that's actually really nice in some respects because if it's invalid, well, here, let me show what the current version does. So the off in this branch here, it looks like this, which you would expect with a Markdown parser, that until you actually render a link, when you complete it, it turns into a link. Now, it's quite nice because as you're typing, you can see the raw markup if you have like a live preview, and then when it's completed, it's done. So the problem is there are advantages to both of these things. It's nice to be able to see like a partially rendered document or to see something rendered with the fallback, but we also want to know if there are ambiguities. As you know, as Elm lovers, as people who love this philosophy of being explicit and having clear error messages and not just oh, you passed an argument that's not the type I expected. Well, let's see what happens. Let's roll the dice, right? We want to make sure that we're respecting the constraints and dealing with exactly what we think we're dealing with, and validate things before we just go do things with them. So how do we get the best of both worlds? So sort of the direction I'm thinking here is that we could have ambiguous, this notion of ambiguous markdown, because there's no such thing as invalid markdown per se. Like, this is valid markdown. It's just that this is the valid markdown for writing this literal text, not a link. And then but it's ambiguous markdown because it's, you know, we're almost expressing some sort of meaningful symbols. So actually, Matt Griffith has done some cool stuff in this area with Elm markup, where he's sort of recovering these errors and showing a partially rendered view. So just the general direction that I'm thinking with ambiguous markdown is that we could render to AST, you know, to a markdown set of markdown blocks that could either be an error or okay. And if it's an error, then you can choose to just say, hey, take all the errors and just render them like they were paragraphs, because that's what like here's I've got some examples of ambiguous markdown here. Like, here's an example of ambiguous markdown. If you start with 2 hashes, it's actually not a heading because headings need a space. And so we could say, well, this is probably not what you intended, and we could wrap that in an error. And we could give a way in the API where you can take all of the blocks that had errors and just say, pretend they didn't have errors and just render it with the fallback. Or we could have a renderer that actually highlights something in red and gives the inline error message. So that's sort of one direction I'm thinking with how to get the best of both worlds, with giving explicit, clear, nice error feedback, And being able to do things like in Elm pages, you can fail the build if there's something wrong, right? So you might want to fail the build if you don't pass certain rules, like if you have an unclosed link or something like that. Yeah, anybody want to add anything to that?
Do you have do you anticipate multiple ambiguities? Like if you might have a piece of text that could generate a number of different things that are valid.
That's an interesting question. Well, you know, there are some interesting cases too, like with Markdown, if you do something like, so if you have like an unclosed code fence, then is this a block or are these inlines? And so Markdown is super weird in that, like, you can actually, it just has all these very strange rules about how you can handle this. And so you could either handle it as, like, I think it's even valid in inlines, in like inline code. I think you can double up the what are called code span, these like inline blocks, and it's valid. So there are a bunch of weird rules. So you're right, there are some cases where it's not only ambiguous, but it's ambiguous and could be interpreted multiple ways. And yeah, I was kind of thinking about what the types could be there, that the error for the ambiguous, we could have a nice custom type that says it was ambiguous. I could have interpreted it as this, but I fell back to this. But you're right, we could have that custom type. We could say, I could have interpreted it as this or this. That's a really nice idea. I like that. Yeah, it's going to take some exploration, but I'll kind of do some experimentation and see what happens there. That's a nice thought.
Interesting.
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next topic?
I'm really hoping that both ways are going to be possible in the future. So you can either handle Markdown like it is handled in most Markdown parsers today.
Right.
So you can just, it falls back to a basic string in case there are errors.
Yes.
But you can still just, check your code for ambiguity. So I really like writing my blog and being sure I don't have any ambiguities in my Markdown, such that I don't publish anything that's ambiguous. But at the same time, I can see that in a chat application, for example, it won't be that important.
Right. Excellent point.
Hey, I'm Thomas. Sorry to interrupt.
Hey, Thomas.
You there. Hi. So for us, we have a lot of user-generated content where we want people to kind of inject library or variables or have them stream variables and data into the templates, essentially, that we want them to write in Markdown. But there, we don't want errors to get in the way of our users doing what they want to do, right? We want to be able to show them ambiguities or errors, but we'd also like them to not pull their hair out because they don't understand it.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. Yeah. This is actually a good segue into the next point, which is so, like, basically, what should the this is not just CommonMark or GitHub flavored Markdown. It's a slightly different spec. So what should the semantics of elm-markdown, or perhaps there should be a different name for it, be? And so my thinking on this has kind of been along the lines of what you two, Philip and Thomas, were just saying. What I'd like is, as much as possible, if you have some Markdown that you copy from whatever regular Markdown context, like you have some Markdown from GitHub README, or Markdown from Ulysses, or this note-taking app that I'm using is a Markdown-based app or whatever. If I take some markdown from a context like that and copy paste it into something that elm-markdown renders, then as much as possible, it should render the same way. It should be interpreted the same way by elm-markdown. So I think that that's pretty much the goal, except for one case, which is if you have HTML, and that's where the semantics differ. It should render exactly like a regular Markdown parser if you use the fallbacks, like we're saying. So if you choose to, you could see that, oh, there was ambiguous Markdown, and you could choose to take that ambiguous Markdown and say, stop everything, don't display. You can do whatever you want, right? You have that type, and you can choose to just render an error, or you could render it with the fallbacks, or you could render it with the fallbacks and then display the error with a highlight red or an underline or whatever, right? But you're in control. But if you use the fallbacks, it should render exactly like you're used to with Markdown. And there's only one place where I think it would be, where the semantics would really be entirely different when you're not using the fallback rendering, and that's with HTML. Because the semantics in regular Markdown with HTML are different. For example, you don't the content within the HTML tags are not interpreted as Markdown. So there are some cases where it is, which is weird, but basically my thinking is that if you have something that looks like HTML in Elm Markdown, then it should behave exactly like you would expect. And that means that, like, the nesting of HTML tags and all of these things, which the semantics of that are very strange in Markdown. So that's the one kind of core place that I think the semantics of Elm Markdown should be different, because that's like kind of one of the key insights. Like if you've seen MDX, it's a similar idea. It's like JSX embedded in Markdown. So the semantics are kind of similar in that if you get the syntax to be something that it's happy with.
Do you have to indent it maybe?
Do I need to indent it?
No.
Huh. Interesting. Interesting. Could have sworn that works. Well, but MDX, it's a similar philosophy. Oh, you have to have a blank line there, which is weird. That I find unnecessary. MDX has that rule. That's surprising, right? Like, that's not intuitive. So I want it to feel intuitive with Elm Markdown, that you just put things, like, it doesn't matter how many blank lines you have to start the Markdown content within your HTML blocks. Like, if it's in an HTML block, it just renders that nested stuff as Markdown content. So yeah, there's a similar philosophy there, except that they in MDX, you actually have import statements, which seems like a very low level type of coupling to have. To me, it should be much more high level, where you just use this sort of declarative style of, like, using high level HTML tags. So that's sort of the core semantic philosophy of Elm Markdown. So cool. Any thoughts on the semantics? Does that seem? Does anybody have any ideas on that direction? If that's a good direction, or something else to consider there?
Well, I'm already using Markdown inside of HTML
Yeah.
tags. So that's extremely useful for me. And also, I really like not having to put like another empty line between my HTML tag and Markdown content, because it's easier to parse with the eyes. You see this HTML tag belongs to this Markdown block because it's closer to the block.
Right. One thing I've been thinking about is because you need so the way I have it now, it doesn't. I was thinking sometimes it's very natural to have indentation, like one level of indentation whenever you open up a new HTML tag. So that's been one thing I've been considering, because right now the way it works is it just considers the indentation to be the baseline level. But there's an argument to be made that that's easier to reason about too, that indent the HTML however you want, but then the nested markdown, if you want to interpret that as a list, like if I put 2 spaces there, then it thinks that that's not, it changes the semantic meaning of it, right? I actually kind of like the simplicity of just saying, just don't indent the markdown content within it, even though that also visually looks a little strange. It's like easier to think about, did I get this right? So that's one thing I'm kind of not sure which direction to go on. So yeah, something to let that idea simmer a little bit, I think.
Kind of curious how a lot of the code editors treat this. Would they auto indent or not following that tag? And not that we necessarily want to design around how editors work, but I'm curious.
That's a great question.
Maybe editors also give a hint about what is the common standard for nested HTML in Markdown.
Okay, I'll put this as a follow-up. This is because this is a good question. Yeah, nice thoughts. Cool. Okay, that's something to explore some more. Yeah.
Yeah, one more thing that popped into my mind is, so you asked the question what we would expect if you, for example, copy and paste Markdown from
Yes.
GitHub or something. And the GitHub flavored Markdown has like those extensions, and you implemented some of those extensions, but they need to be like coded in the parser. I'm not really sure, but
yes,
I would not really expect like those to render like those, like it's on GitHub right now. And
yes.
but yeah, so it's nice to support those extensions, but I'm not really sure if those should be built in. And because then you have to draw a line, which one do I want and how do I want to support like any extension? And yeah.
That's a great point. So one thing we could do, so for anybody who hasn't seen this, I know some people are already intimately familiar. I think we've got Thomason on the call, maybe not. But Stephen and Philip, I know, are intimately familiar with this folder, which is the test results. It's pretty cool. I run the marked.js spec, which has like over 1,000 test cases that are just literally like, if I click to this, you can see it takes me to the CommonMark spec, and you can see the exact test case that's failing. And it tells you, I expected this output, but instead I got this output. So I'm actually running the test cases for CommonMark and GitHub flavored Markdown. And I'm just using the marked.js test suite, which is what the Elm Explorations Markdown library uses. So what we could do is we could do a similar thing to a lot of Markdown parser APIs, which is that they have like a set of options you pass in and you say, do you want to enable these GitHub extensions or not? Or do you want to go in CommonMark mode? And then in the end-to-end tests, which run all of these test cases and give us the failing output, we could turn on or off those options to go in CommonMark compatibility mode or GitHub flavored Markdown mode. And then try as much as possible to get to spec compliance with those, except in the cases where, like I described, the semantics are intentionally different because of the HTML semantics being different. So that's something to think about. I think I like that idea. And I think in terms of making this library like a good candidate for being like a community resource for like, okay, we have people who are like parsing Markdown and turning it into like, you know, what's his name, Manuel Fuchs counterpoint rules or whatever, and like, you know, making scheme interpreters and live visualizations on blogs and cool stuff like that. And that's like one group of users. But then maybe somebody, maybe like the Elm package documentation site just wants to use, it wants to stop using a package with native code, the Elm Explorations Markdown, which just wraps the marked.js library. So it would be kind of compelling to be able to support cases like that. Although the fact that the semantics are different for the HTML, I wonder if that's a good goal for it to be a replacement for tools like that, which are trying to faithfully render what, like faithfully render your README from your GitHub README or something like that. So that's something to think about. But I think I like the idea of having a CommonMark compatibility mode or a GitHub flavored Markdown mode. That seems reasonable.
I fear that in the case there are some flags you can turn on and off.
Yes.
That, for example, someone who writes a renderer for their Markdown that might not be written in GitHub flavored Markdown will have to give an implementation, for example, for rendering tables, which I believe are GitHub flavored Markdown.
Yes.
And this might be confusing or maybe even impossible, depending on what the person is planning to implement, or he'd have to provide a weird stub that just does nothing if the GitHub flavored Markdown flag isn't turned on.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of like the idea of not Boolean flags, but flags which inform the types. But I believe that might be pretty advanced or hard to do, maybe. So maybe it would be possible to track what kind of GitHub or not GitHub flavored Markdown, what kind of Markdown it is in the types, for example. So this might be maybe something to keep in mind.
This is a very good point. Okay, I'm going to put this in the follow-up because this, I think, is going to need some deeper thought, but these are really great points. Cool. Nice. Okay. I'm sure we could go a lot deeper on that thread, but I think let's sleep on that one a little bit and do some more thinking. These are great things to. This forum, I think, is really nice to sort of get the big ideas out there and do some discussion. And then actually, I've been really enjoying having some in-depth discussion with some of the people on this call to discuss some of these ideas really in depth. been a great way to go. Okay, so now does so the fact, let's say that we're not going to support any sort of different HTML rendering semantics. That we're going to be opinionated, you know, maybe we have a markdown CommonMark compatibility mode where we parse the we don't parse GitHub flavored markdown tables and the other extensions in GitHub flavored markdown. But we're going to be opinionated about the semantics of blocks, of HTML blocks, because that is like a core design principle in elm-markdown. So if we assume that that's the goal and the intention, in that case, should this library be called elm-markdown or should it be called something else? And should we have a term for like the semantics of like the spec for this? What do you all think about that? Like, does it deserve a different name? I'm also noticing that sometimes people, like somebody was asking the other day, they were asking some really good questions like, hey, what's the difference between like Dylan Kern's elm-markdown and these other elm-markdown libraries? Why would I want to use this one? And it was like, I mean, it makes sense. Like, it just looks like another markdown parser, but like MDX, which is like JSX within Markdown, it has a pretty clear set of semantics that the name tips you off to, which is nice. So should elm-markdown have something like that?
Let's call it EMX. I don't know. I wanted to throw MDX into this discussion too, because I think extended is one of the keywords that maybe provokes just the right kind of thought in users.
Right.
Yeah, that's what attracted me to this was the extensibility, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Extensibility is definitely a key concept here. Yeah, so I wonder if there's like I wonder if if the name of the package could be like Elm extensible markdown or Elm markdown. Like initially my thinking was that it was almost like an HTML decoder. It's like that was the core concept, that you could kind of validate the HTML blocks that are coming in, and then like a JSON decoder, you can do this step where in a single step you're both validating and then filtering down and transforming it into a specific type. So it
turns out that naming is pretty hard.
Naming is hard. Naming is hard, and it's also like a forcing function. Makes you have like a clear vision that you can express concisely. So it's a good exercise.
Well, I like to think about what the intent is for naming things, like, because you're right. As an outsider, as in having not used this more than just the introduction,
Mm-hmm.
you don't think that it's anything but just a markdown renderer.
Right.
And I think that's a shame.
Right.
Because it can do so much more. So for us, it's about being able to let people template things, right? Essentially, but that's just one use case. So maybe that's not a valid name.
It kind of like the simplicity of just elm-markdown, and it kind of fits into the elm way of things.
Right.
And you can put a lot of effort into the documentation itself to have like a path from beginner to a more advanced things. And here you can tell a nice story there. And for example, the parser and parser module, there's the parser one, the simple one, and then the parser.advanced. And yeah, I think so. Yeah, this would. I think elm-markdown is just fine, and people I'm not really sure how long the elm-markdown, the elm core markdown package will live, because it has like this special native code, and it's for my expectation, it would be like this would like not survive some other elm versions.
Yeah.
And then it's good to have like a replacement that's just for anybody, and
Right.
yeah, you tell a nice story for extended people to in the documentation itself.
Right. Actually, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for giving me two exactly opposing opinions, so I can justify whatever, whatever my, whatever I'm feeling like when I wake up tomorrow. But so yeah, I agree, Jonas, that I think that I suspect that Evan would like to have a pure Elm implementation of a Markdown parser, so he can drop the native code version. And it would be cool to, you know, at least make an effort to have this library be like a community standard, if there's a way for these different needs of these different people's use cases to be supported there. One thing I've noticed in like for example, on the Elm package documentation site, I've stubbornly refused to change it because GitHub renders image tags, and but one day suddenly the Elm package site updated and then it stopped rendering HTML tags. So that means the fact that it doesn't render HTML tags, it just renders them as raw HTML. It could actually be an opportunity for like using Elm Markdown and saying like, these are the safe things that you can put in, like an image tag is safe and you can put these attributes in it. And so, oh, the alt text has a typo. Anyway, okay, cool. So I think this is another one to sort of keep pondering, but it's really great to get everybody's perspectives on this to kind of keep the ideas flowing and see where that goes. So thanks for that. So cool. Oh yeah, please, Phil.
I like to throw some more crazy idea in there.
Yes.
So I think of elm-markdown right now, just it could be split apart into two things. So one thing is the elm-markdown parser, which would be called just elm-markdown, and which basically just parse markdown into this kind of markdown structure, and into another package which does all of the smart things like this kind of HTML decoder thing. So for example, what if we treated the content of HTML tags as strings in the first case,
right?
And then left the decision to do of what to do with the inside of the HTML tags to the user. So they would be able to decide whether HTML tags contents should be indented, or whether they should be interpreted as Markdown or interpreted as it is defined in the Markdown standard. And I think if you split this apart like that, it would be possible to both satisfy users that want to use it, for example, for the packages.elmlang.org website, because they might want to have perfect compliance with CommonMark and GitHub flavored Markdown, but also at the same time support these power users who do this weird stuff like music annotation and blog posts and want to have Markdown inside of HTML elements.
Right. Yeah. That thought has crossed my mind too, and I think it's a really interesting concept. The one thing that gets tricky is if it changes the way that the semantics work, then the string that's parsed initially may be different. Or maybe not. Like the way that let's see, I've got my handy dandy Markdown resources. so you can like see the syntax trees that these parse to. Let's see, so this is parsing this value. I think it parses it as just, it says just JSX. Why is it grabbing the world at the end there? I'm not sure. There's another one. Yeah. So this is remark. So if I say, if I do this, it just says this is HTML, and it just uses. So there are weird rules with Markdown. Like even if I just have a closing tag that is like a hanging closing tag, then it says, oh, that's HTML. You're like, what? Like, it's just a hanging closing tag. It's like, yeah, but the type of that is raw HTML. Like, just put that in the document. You're like, what? But so like, I think you can even yeah, so it'll even grab the next line if there's no blank line after, and slurp that up as part of the HTML, which is, the semantics are weird. So my point is, I really like the idea. I think that there may be a few weird parsing cases like that that would actually change semantically what gets considered to be a logical block of HTML, and that may throw a wrench in that idea. But I really like the thought of having these like extension points that allow you to use the same building blocks of these different parts of the package for different purposes. I like that extensibility idea a lot. Okay, so let's. I think that's enough ideation on that to give us some steam to continue exploring this this direction here. So let me move on to the next point in the agenda here. So similar to what Philip was just talking about in terms of like extensibility, actually Philip has been helping me quite a bit with doing some code experiments and some discussions around the design of doing a sort of like transformation API that allows you to take, it'll allow you to do various things. For example, it'll allow you to like lint your markdown structure. So you could, I've actually got like some examples of some things you could do with it here. Let me go to the right branch. Okay, so like, for example, here's a helper that says, let's validate links. Or so right now, the way we validate links is the renderer is returning renderer is returning results for image and link, which means that you can return an error and it will fail the markdown parser. So Philip and I have been talking about this idea of removing the result from these two spots and replacing it with a sort of like validation steps like this. So you could validate links like this. You could say that I've got like, here's my resolve link in inline function, and it takes like an inline block, and if it's a link, then it looks up the link, I've got this lookup link function that just looks up this sort of key, elm-lang, and it looks that up. You could look it up with a dictionary or whatever. This is just you know, kind of showing one example, and it'll give an error if it can't find the key. So so like here's a test case these tests are all passing. So if you look up if you have a block, if you have a paragraph with a link where the link itself is just the key angular, it says I couldn't find the key. It gives you an error there. So this is just like traversing your sort of parsed AST, and we can do validations, we can give errors, we could give warnings or whatever we want to do. So this is something Philip and I are working on, is sort of an API to have like a, so it's quite exciting, because what this means is that we can have all sorts of like community packages that allow you to do validations like this, and you can plug it into different things. You know, you could say you could have like a transformer that says the title casing rules for headings are this, and so we use this title casing style, so go through all of the headings and apply this transformation to them, and then it just transforms that block. Someone could publish that as a package. Somebody could publish something that you know, bumps down the heading levels from down one level, so H1s become H2s. Or you could have something that validates that a heading, you know, headings follow the right order. So another thing I'm looking at here is actually doing some things that have context. So instead of just mapping one block to another block or one inline to another inline, actually traversing it and being able to fold over with context, and then transform it into a block which has metadata about that block. That's not just turn this block into this block, but add some context around it, some metadata. So for example, like if we wanted to add a slug that you could use to link to certain headings, that's not something that, I mean, we could just change the markdown, but it's nice if we have that as metadata that we can render independently of like a markdown block. So that's something that that we've been working on. Now, so one thing, Philip made this sort of experimental pull request here where we're playing around with some ideas. And so one idea that Philip had here that I think could be a cool direction to explore is the idea of having the markdown renderers, instead of being a record where you have like, here's how you render headings, here's how you render code spans. It would actually be a function that passes in this block custom type. So here, let me open up a doc preview of the branch I have that the latest code that I'm going to merge in soon. So we've got this like block structure. What if the renderer function, so instead of the renderer being a record like this that says given a heading, what and the children of that heading, which are these views, how do you render the heading? Given a paragraph, how do you turn a list of views into a paragraph? We could have we could pass it a block where the block has a type variable. So instead of HTML block having nested blocks, it has the view. So in the case of the block AST, this type variable for the block would be, the children would be blocks. But when you call the renderer function, the children would be the rendered views, not the block AST. So you don't have to recursively, see, that's the important thing, is then you don't have to recursively call call render on the AST that you get for the children, because you don't get the AST, you get a view or a list of views. Are there any thoughts on that? I think that's kind of an exciting, I think that opens up some cool possibilities. So I think that could be a fun thing to explore.
Yeah, just explanation-wise, something, some more reasoning why I experimented with this kind of type was, if you look at the renderer type as it is right now, it has this view parameter.
Yes.
And it ties the inputs of each element to the output type of each element. So if someone is writing something that, for example, renders to a function, this view type is going to be a function. So for example, in paragraph, it's going to be a list of functions to a function.
Yeah.
And what this means is that the user who implements paragraph will have to write the plumbing that correctly puts the functions parameter into all of the list's input parameters. And the same goes if you do different things. For example, if you render to a result, or if you render to a static HTTP request, things like that. And if you split up these two parts, so paragraph list view becomes one thing, which is the case when I have these kind of block structure data type, then it's possible to render to a different kind of result than what is inside of the block structure parameter. This is kind of hard to explain with words without code, but
okay.
So this,
I'm gonna need to follow up with you after this call about that, because I want to hear more
Okay.
about that. Because yeah, cool. Because I think this is really cool. Because I'm very excited about the. Let me go back to this code here. I'm very excited about this sort of transformer API. I think that this is very much the direction that I see for this library, is that, I mean, when you have nicely typed data in Elm, there's so much cool stuff you can do with it, right? That's like one of the superpowers of Elm. And so if we give you this really cool, data type of the, your markdown blocks, and then we say like, oh, actually you can sort of add this metadata onto those, or you can validate things based on those blocks, or transform them based on these rules. And then people can start publishing packages to share little transformations and stuff. I think that just leverages and taps into Elm's superpower of using the type system to do really cool things easily and safely. So I'm really excited about that, and I think that this design that Philip came up with to render to the custom type will be really cool, because you can kind of have this metadata that you can wrap around that type more easily. Not to mention that it would reduce the duplication, where right now the renderer sort of is duplicated. The renderer is sort of duplicating the types of the AST. The blocks are this one custom type, and then we're basically like taking the pieces of these custom type variants and turning them into a record where they're arguments in a function. So I like the deduplication there as well. So cool. So does anybody want to add anything on that topic? Cool. Okay, one last thought that I'll leave with here. Another thing I'm considering is the idea of sort of like a custom parser extension. So it could be, I think it could be interesting to have the ability, like I've had people mention, like it's common for math like LaTeX implementations to have blocks that are surrounded with double dollar signs. So you could imagine having like an extension point that says, hey, I want to define a way to parse out a particular custom block. So that's another thing I'm thinking about.
That would be very useful for us. I
Oh
think.
yeah,
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, first off, I think it would be a natural way to insert variables and data into mid-sentences and such, rather than having to write a custom tag that said, parameter or variable or whatever, and then do it that way.
Like a templating sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's our use case for this, right? It's templating.
Do you already have a templating syntax that you're using?
Yeah, we do. So we use, it's pretty horrible actually. we're using the experiments elm-markdown, but we're then, before we send it to that, we're parsing out this using regular expressions and kind of looking for these exactly like you're doing here, $, but we just do curly brackets instead, and insertion points for
like double curlies, like
exactly so like handlebars and so on. But also
cool.
we have a query language, right? And quite often just like you would do the triple backticks to write a code snippet, something that would be just natural, right? Because it's such an integral part of writing anything in our system, right? Using that. Just some thoughts.
So, okay, cool. So actually another thing that has crossed my mind, I've been thinking about how to, I think that there are some cool possibilities that are opened up when we take like valid markdown syntax, where in a lot of cases things are thrown away, but if we give you that information as meta information about the blocks, we can do some cool things. So for example, like DecSet is this slide tool I use sometimes, which just you just write like a markdown file and it creates slides and like does some nice formatting for them by default. And so one of the things that they use is these code blocks, and it's kind of cool. Like they'll do so you can let's see, where is an example? I think there's an example somewhere, but so sometimes I'll see like people will have this info after the triple backtick that is like this info string that they'll use to say, okay, here's a code block, but highlight these lines, or they'll give some other meta information. So this is like Markdown will consider this the language, but I think if you have a space after, it'll throw it away, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So see, like this is how the remark library parses this. It says this is a code block. The language is JavaScript, because this is what the Markdown specification says. This is JavaScript, but you can have all sorts of other stuff after. And so we can capture that, because as far as Markdown is concerned, like GitHub is just going to throw that away when it renders the Markdown. It's just going to throw away this is info. But we can capture it in the AST. So we can give you that metadata in the block, and then you can do cool things with it.
Yeah, that would be very, very cool, because that would mean that we could, for instance, do reports and have people write out the query in blocks like this, and then configure how it should be presented in our system.
I think this is a very cool opportunity, because this is like very much another thing that I see as like core to the vision here, is that use Markdown syntax as much as possible, so that you could render it as a sort of progressive enhancement in a way, right? Where like if you look at this with the GitHub renderer on a GitHub README, then it'll look fine. But if you render it with your custom elm-markdown parser, then it's going to take this extra bit of information which is being thrown away by the GitHub README, but it's going to do some extra clever thing and display the, you know, Humio special like code snippet thing or whatever. So I think that's kind of a cool opportunity there. Yeah, like let's see, where's my yeah, so that, I think that opens up some cool possibilities to add those little bits of metadata to the blocks.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
This
cool.
is also how how AMDX does it. So there's, for example, React Live. I posted this as a link in the chat.
Oh, cool.
And they just annotate, for example, some code in the Markdown, and you annotate it with live equals true, and it starts to evaluate what's inside of the code.
Oh, cool. Very cool. Nice. That's
so it
awesome.
seems to be kind of a standard.
Yeah.
Which is awesome.
That exactly. Yeah. I love that kind of thing. Okay, great. So that's a quite easy thing to add in to the parser, to just grab that and then store it in the block type. And then I think again, you know, back to this design that Philip's been working on to use the custom type as the way of rendering rather than a record. Again, that just gives you that metadata that you can ignore or use to do whatever you like, because you just get the direct block. So that'll be kind of cool too. So cool. I think that covers all the core ideas. Any closing thoughts?
Well, I have a newbie question.
Sure.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier on that you render to functions, right? And if I understand that correctly, it means that you parse the markup, and then you create functions based on that are essentially you can pass variables to, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So our use case, right, is that the user we would have dashboards where the user could create different templates, and we would then pass, you know, data into those templates on an ongoing basis. But so what occurs to me is that they're functions, and the kosher-ness of putting functions into your model, because we would need to store them. I would know, or is it okay to reparse these things on every view render?
I mean, I do, and I mean that's what B. Burdett's example here does. It's pretty cool. Like you can see it. It's re-rendering the whole thing. I mean, of course, it's a modestly sized document, and perhaps you're dealing with larger sized documents.
No,
but
I don't think it's going to be bad. I mean,
okay.
it's just that there's going to be potentially a lot of them, and it is running on like Raspberry Pis and so on. So performance is a concern.
Yeah.
But would you reparse the template on every render, or would you cache them?
It's a good question. I mean, you could probably use some sort of like HTML.lazy or whatever, right?
Yeah, sure. But the problem is that the input variables change pretty much every second.
Okay.
So that would mean that you would also reparse the template, right?
Well, this
you can't just put the functions in your model. I mean, there's not necessarily anything wrong with that.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. Yeah.
Just in my experience, sorry, this is Matt.
Yeah.
For like one of the considerations with Elm markup was definitely that parsing any size document beyond a trivial one is a lot of work. So how Elm markup is kind of made to work is that you parse the document once, and then you sort of are in this situation where you have this AST, and then you can sort of modify that AST. And so that was the approach to get around this in that situation. Obviously that took a lot of work to sort of set that up. But I would expect to, like, parsing any size document, you should definitely check out like how fast it's going, because it may be kind of tough.
Yeah, but you can definitely store the function in your model. If it's like, this is the markdown for this page that I'm on right now, and it has these placeholders that I'm gonna use whatever values that are changing every second for those placeholders. Then you could, I don't think there's any reason not to just render that to a function, and then you've got that function and you call it every second when things change. I'd imagine that would work pretty well for the particular.
Yeah, sure. So the only concern is that it's not that we ever do this, but you couldn't serialize your model, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that would be the only thing. Not that that's a real concern.
Well, let's. Why don't you keep in touch with me about how that goes? Because I think it's really good to like try these things out, see how they look, see how it feels, see what things come up, and let me know how that goes, because I'd love to hear and get your insight from that. So cool, cool. And then one last closing note. So I'm talking to a couple of community members, Stephen and Thomason, who have been doing some really cool contributions to the main parser, about doing like a live stream to do some coding on the elm-markdown parser. So so stay tuned. I'm actually working on like a little page, like an events page, to list out the community calls like this one for this library and others. So I will send out some updates on that soon in the Markdown channel and the Elm Pages channel. Be doing a live coding session, and in general, anybody who wants to do some live coding. Philip, you've been doing a bunch of cool stuff. Maybe we can do a live coding thing together sometime. Or anybody who just wants to do some live coding as a way to I think it's a cool way to share with the community some of the cool ways to use these tools, and also like some of the ways to contribute to these tools for people, because it can be really fun. I know some people have done some really cool contributions on the Markdown parser, and it's fun working on a parser and just having a spec and trying to get some things passing. So I'm trying to make that a little more approachable too, by doing some live coding sessions and sharing some of the knowledge on how to contribute. So if anybody's interested in any of those things, if anybody's interested in like doing live coding with me on a cool project, let me know and stay tuned. And yeah, thank you all so much for coming and sharing your insights. It's great having you all.
Great. Thanks for the session.
My pleasure.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you all for joining. This was a lot of fun. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.